And one of the real issues in this world of climate change is actually as soon as you start forcing people to compromise their lifestyle, they'll find any excuse not to. And so technology has a huge role to make sure that people can actually reduce their resource consumption without having to make that compromise, and ideally save them money along the way.
Hi, I'm Belden Mankus. Welcome to the Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders are doing and what they've learned along the way. My guest today is Robin Stopford, CEO of Powervault, a company that he joined a year ago in November 2023. Powervault designs and makes high-quality batteries that store cheap electricity from solar panels and from the grid. It also makes software called Smart Store, trademark, which optimizes the customer's energy use and solar battery in real time. One of the company's first-generation batteries is now on display at the Science Museum's Green Energy Gallery. Robin, welcome to the Purposeful Strategist podcast.
Hi, Belden, thank you.
Maybe we can hear a little bit about you and about Powervault.
Sure. So yeah, as you say, I joined Powervault almost a year ago. Goodness, it's been a fast 11 months. So as you say, Powervault is a battery supply business into solar storage, primarily for domestic customers, but also some small commercial. We've been around for 10 years. One of the founders actually has already been on this conversation, Andrew Wordsworth. So he was part of the thinking back in 2012 when they saw the opportunity to connect batteries to solar panels that were starting to be installed on people's roofs. As you say, we are a battery business with optimizing software that maximizes the benefit that the batteries can create. We started 10 years ago, really with the idea of capturing the excess solar as solar panels were going in. This is back in the day when there were lead acid batteries. And it was almost something cooked up from taking batteries from Halfords and figuring out how to make it work. And from that, the team evolved into now a much more modern product with lithium iron phosphate batteries, as is the industry standard. We're a small team, 24 people based in Hendon, where we have a factory. A lot of our product and the basic components come in from China, but we're a made in Britain business because our firmware that sits on top of the inverter and battery fundamentally changes the performance of that system. And on top of it, we have our controlling software, which provides that optimization capability. Now, we've demonstrated over the last 3 or 4 years where we've been running that software, the sort of optimization will almost double the impact of the battery. And even if you have a simple scheduling set up on the battery so that you're taking advantage of cheap electricity in your tariff, our software will still outperform that, typically by 40%. And that's because it looks at the weather forecast in your area. It looks at the way you personally use your electricity and the tariff that you're on, and so optimizes the cycling because it knows that in the morning, for example, you don't use much electricity, but there's going to be nice weather tomorrow. So rather than charging up fully overnight, it'll wait for the good dose of free renewable solar electricity and then charge your battery from there. And when, of course, then if it's going to be cloudy and it's not going to get so much solar, then actually it will charge up overnight and therefore give you enough power so that in your time of use tariff, you're not then paying excess when the more expensive hours come in later in the day. And that's the fundamental point behind it.
Robin, that's really fascinating. I mean, just the way you're using the technology there. In some senses, it's clearly the use of certain amounts of algorithms and prediction and a bunch of things that you might call that artificial intelligence.
I think it absolutely is artificial intelligence. It's a machine learning software, so it's micro artificial intelligence rather than macro. So it's not looking at gigantic, huge amounts of data that is writing things based on everything available in the web, but it's making smart decisions easy. Talking about purpose and strategy, and one of the things for me that led me to this business was precisely that. I think climate change is something that I see as being a reality. It affects the world increasingly. But again and again, you hear people talking about, it's not really a thing. It's just a phase. It's a cycle. And what I often see is the people who are reacting that way are often those who are having to compromise their lifestyle. And one of the real issues in this world of climate change is actually as soon as you start forcing people to compromise their lifestyle, they'll find any excuse not to. And so technology has a huge role to make sure that people can actually reduce their resource consumption without having to make that compromise, and ideally save them money along the way. And then even more so, and this is, I think, where sort of the cleverer bits come, is then allow them to engage in whatever it is in a way that means that they choose to reduce their resource consumption and get rid of the waste out of their life without actually feeling that they are the worse off for it.
Yeah.
That's where, if we're going to make a real step forward in any of this, I think those sorts of dynamics become really important. And this is what our algorithm does in the use of electricity, so that you have visibility and suddenly you then can see the impact of using too much and you can reduce it. I mean, for example, one of our customers has more than doubled his use of electricity over the past 5 years because he's electrified his Arga, he's added an EV, and he's halved his cost of electricity. So his per unit cost of electricity is down by a quarter because he's got plenty of free solar electricity, but also using better time of use tariffs. And that's, I think, how you can then end up in a better place.
Yeah, obviously the benefit in terms of climate is great. But the other thing I like about it is most AI, it's been deployed on the side of the big boys, of organizations, businesses, government, whatever. This is AI deployed on the side of the individual. I really love that.
Yes. We'll talk about our purpose statement in a minute, I'm sure. But this is about allowing the customer, the consumer, to be in control. You're not compromising because you're signing up to a bigger program. It's allowing you to have the information to make the choices.
Well, let's go straight into that. What is the purpose?
So our purpose is to be part of the solution to climate change by transforming the way people use energy.
Mm-hmm. And when you showed up, not quite a year ago, 11 months ago, was that already there and everybody in the organization knew what it was and said it, or did you kind of help pull that together in those words?
We had a more sort of traditional mission and vision structure that talked about deploying Powervaults and the impact they could have on the world. And I guess I've spent the last number of years really thinking about purpose versus mission vision and does one matter or not. And it's often very easy to say, oh, either is fine. But actually, in my world, I suppose, the mission and vision is about what you as a company are going to do. Whereas a purpose is much more about what's the role of the company in society. Lifting your head out of what we're doing into a bigger picture actually is really helpful for everybody. It gets you away from a world of Milton Friedman and shareholder value creation. That's ultimately, of course, what we need to do in order to attract investment to continue. But having that ability to engage with all of your other stakeholders in a coherent and specific way, whether they are customers or employees or suppliers or your local community. I mean, I think all of those elements are as important. And often in a world where people are thinking about where do I want to go and where do I want to spend my time, being able to articulate that becomes really important to attract the right talent into a business. And I guess I have a view coming from a management consulting background. All of that's nice and good and fluffy. But actually, unless you're going to get better performance out of it as well, then perhaps it's easy to dismiss it. And so we've spent quite a lot of time thinking about, if we care about those individual stakeholders, what do we do differently as a result? How do we, for example, engage with customers in a different way rather than just transacting with them? How do we think about which suppliers we choose? How do we think about how we engage with our community and what our role there is? And we're in the foothills of this journey, the evolution of a purpose. But it creates a landscape in which we can operate where everybody understands sort of what their role is and why they're doing it. That's a really important piece of it.
Mm-hmm. Can you think of an incident, almost sort of a story that illustrates the way that purpose is shaping the way you make business decisions or the way you interact with different stakeholder groups?
Yeah. One of the experiments we're doing with customers, we've typically just sort of sold product to customers and then forgotten about it, but not actually then providing any kind of change into our organization. We've taken a view that says Net Promoter Score is an interesting metric that lots of people use. And in a purpose world, that becomes really interesting if you follow it through and you stay true to the point of taking a Net Promoter Score, whereby you ask the customer on a scale of 1 to 10, how strongly would you recommend us to a neighbor? Then taking that feedback, and we ask 3 simple questions. We get the feedback, we put it back into the organization and share it. Share the score, share the feedback, and make a change. If the feedback is useful and there's been a nice recommendation, we'll think about why we've had that score, and we'll take that feedback in a very straightforward way and think about the processes we can improve or the additions we can make. And then we'll let the customer know. Either if it's specific to them because it's very bespoke to their own requirements, we'll let them know through a phone call or an email. Or in our sort of general weekly, monthly email communications, we then update customers and say, here's what was changed. It allows the organization to have greater visibility on what the customers are thinking because they can all see it too. And it means that the customer engagement isn't limited to just the 3 or 4 people who are dealing with them. Suddenly it becomes much more visible. The key to doing that, of course, is that it doesn't become a metric that you're measuring performance by, but actually is just part of the environment in the business and is non-judgmental, and you're just taking that input. So far, after a month of doing it, it's really easy. As we go on, it will become harder to keep it live and fresh. That'll be a nice problem to have when we get to that stage.
And I assume you've got a business strategy, which I'm going to want to explore a little bit in a minute. But what role did the purpose play when you were developing that strategy, and how do the two fit together?
I suppose I came in at a moment of potentially crisis in the company. We were losing money. We're still not yet break even. The market in which we were operating was really shrinking. Our cost base was 30% too high. Our customers were finding different solutions, and we needed to do something to be pretty radical in our changing. So it was really a process of figuring out what our right to play in the market as we then define it, and make sure that we live up to the legacy that had been created over the past 10 years. I mean, if we have a product that's sitting in the Science Museum, and by the way, seeing the founder of the business standing next to a Powervault that he'd probably built with his own hands, sitting in the Science Museum just along the corridor from the rocket and the Eagle, was kind of amazing. It's something I've never seen in my life. I really will remember that moment. That's part of the legacy that we have as a business, and to have a history when you're 10 years old is a good thing. But we could have disappeared beneath the waves of corporate history last year and no one would really have noticed. That's a terrible place to get to. So actually we had a starting question of, well, what is our right to exist? If we're going to live up to that, how do we then make it worthwhile? We had a balance sheet that we could use to really answer that question. But you've got to be pretty clear in the strategy in order to get to a place where actually you're going to know the answer to that question. Because there's no point in drifting for another 10 years. It either needs to be, yeah, we can see a future or not. We figured that we probably had about 12 months and we're kind of at that point. But to the question of how then we thought about purpose and strategy, well, they're interlinked. And defining the markets we were going to play in and how the purpose is then actually almost the guiding light of, in this environment and where we're choosing to head, how do we then start choosing the right customer segments, the right behaviors that we want to deploy, the right stakeholders we want, the right communities we want to partner with, the way in which we choose to model some of our future business practice. Actually, all of that is going to be guided by the purpose. And this is a small team, 25 people, where actually creating a common culture was really important. And the purpose has a big role in that because everybody can go back and refer to it. We don't have it in great big banners around the office. We don't need to. Everybody sort of understands it. We spent time as a leadership team while we were figuring out our strategy and how do we create a market where we could be successful. And then how do we start defining the purpose to start shaping that? And then we spent time with the rest of the team to go through both the strategy and the purpose, and does the purpose resonate? And they all had a voice in it. And then lots of the sort of the so whats of, well, what does this then mean? What are we choosing not to do? What are we choosing to do? What does it really mean? Are the words actually important or not? To your point of actually being, we and allowing people to be in control rather than big organizations. And that's part of what we're not going to be. That's quite important.
And so it sounds like it was a fairly inclusive process. How long did all that take?
A month, 6 weeks, probably.
So pretty quick.
Yeah, and I think a purpose is something that evolves, like a coat. You wear it and see how it feels, and adjust it if you need to, and tweak it, and maybe take it in a bit. I mean, the coat's perhaps not the right metaphor, but you understand what I mean. I would never want to be a slave to the purpose, but more actually make sure it is really a reflection of who we are. And we'll revisit it properly in 2 or 3 years' time and sort of go back to it and say, is this still the purpose of the organization? Does it still really reflect where we're going. Otherwise, you get sort of stuck. And I think revisiting some of those basic assumptions on who you are as an organization is fundamental.
One of the things I've observed is that sometimes it's the process of going through and the discussion and kind of often much more important than whatever words you end up with, which I think is why in a lot of big organizations that stuff all lands so flat, because it lands with people who weren't part of it.
I mean, of course, even in a team of 24 people, there are some people who don't really care. They're here just to earn a wage and do whatever. But it allows everybody to have a voice if they want to. In my previous role, a much bigger company with 3,500 people, that's one of the hard things. How do you build that sense of inclusivity? It almost becomes a thing that people look at. They need to at least understand what it's about. It's difficult to do. And perhaps it takes time.
What are your current strategic objectives? I mean, what's the next year hold?
Well, the journey we've been on in the past year has been fascinating. We launched a product in the middle of July that was 40% cheaper than the product we had last year. It was redesigned so that instead of sitting in a small niche, we accessed a market 10 times the size. It had a supply chain that allowed us to scale it much faster. A lot of the product was being made in Asia, and then we were adding the refinements on top. It is consistent enough so we can sell through intermediaries rather than having to sell it ourselves or to install it ourselves. So we use installers for who are installing new solar as well as battery storage. And suddenly that gives us an opportunity to scale. So suddenly we've built something whereby we have a right to play in a much bigger market. And we've built the channel to go with it. We're 3 months in, so we are genuinely at the start of this journey. But last month, in September, we had our biggest order month ever. So there's a heartbeat, which is important. And actually all of those processes we put in place are starting to show some feedback. The pathway over the next year is to break even. I think we've demonstrated to ourselves that we have a product and a platform that will allow us to get there. We've demonstrated and really assessed the value of the algorithm so that we can see how that sits on top. Then as we start building those together, we're going to be developing a next level of technology. We'll have a subscription service that sits on top, allowing people to engage in the grid flexibility, which is going to be a big part of the pathway to net zero and creating microgrid generation. If we talk about smart grids, that ultimately you have to have individual households in a position whereby they can get some benefit out of it, get some value from that process that goes into their pocket that they can see visibly. That's ultimately where we're going to spend a lot of the time over the next year. We're starting to experiment how to do that, both on our own with some small groups of customers, but also with some of the aggregators and potentially also some utilities too. So we're looking at how that journey will evolve. We're now in that process of fundraising whereby we're seeking capital to kind of get us onto the next road. I think one of the things I've learned as sitting in an entrepreneurial world is you're probably always fundraising. That's just part of life.
Mm-hmm.
So 26 then becomes interesting with a next phase in the technology, starting to move international and starting to really cement our position in the market.
So you are looking to expand beyond the UK?
Absolutely. I mean, we're UK only today. I mean, I think defining the market you choose to be in is really important, but we will create a product whereby it is transferable into other markets. We'll be working with partners locally rather than trying to do it all ourselves, I'm sure. And that's about deploying a technology that people are going to want to be using that is giving them access to some upside and grid flexibility.
Mm-hmm. Clearly, battery science has come on a long way. And one imagines that that's going to continue for a while. But what's your sense of that? Do you expect to see that continue to develop? And if so, how's it going to affect what you're doing?
It's got to develop. The negative aspects of lithium ion are well trodden. Rare earth metals, the extraction process, the impact on the communities where that happened is awful. I see it very much as a transient phase, and there will be other technologies. And as the market grows, the demand will be there for the investment that is going into whether it's sodium ion or zinc or even ferrous batteries will start taking hold. Sodium ion is talked about. There are sort of 4 or 5 different threads that are going there. Commercialization seems to be getting pushed out, but I'm hopeful that something will come to market. And we've certainly designed our business model so that as those technologies come in, we are not restricted to sodium ion, but we could take another battery and put it into our platform. And one of our roles is to curate good technology so that we're making the best that's available accessible to our customers. So always on the lookout for a better battery.
Do you see any move, sort of sideways? I get you've got some firmware and some software and some services. Underneath that, you've got a battery. That battery could change, but the battery is sort of the battery. Are there any other sort of application areas or other spaces where you want to take that model of this sort of an underlying something, but we're providing the smarts on top?
The obvious immediate adjacency is heating. Home energy, domestic energy, or domestic heating is sort of 75% of the energy use in a home, typically. There are lots of others who are starting to think about how do we think about the home energy management system, HEMS, it's even got an acronym. If our technology is successful enough, clearly we could play. I think most of all, we'd like to be a widget that sits into those platforms and make sure it's seamlessly communicating in there. We're trying to transform the way people use energy. And so that's then about making sure that it's seamless. And you want all of these things to sit together.
Yeah. Looking back on your almost first year as Powervault CEO, what stands out for you?
What stands out? It's been an interesting journey. I think the need to build a team and figure out who are the right people. Jim Collins in his book Good to Great talks about having the right people on the bus. This is my first role as CEO. I mean, it's a tiny company, but I suppose ultimately you still have all the functions you have, whether they are 1,000 people in each of them or 2. And you're knitting together something that is, a fairly sort of complex beast. And you can't do it all yourself. It's all about making sure you've got the right people around you who can own their space and understand what their role is in the overall team, and that you have an open enough communication capability with them so that you can have those tough debates and make sure you iron out the wrinkles in it and continue to evolve. And I think that's one of the things that really stands out.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I would point to is coming in with investors into an organization like this. I was coming into a business where ultimately it's a small team and I was pushing people out of what they had been doing. And for them to have the generosity to step back and let me get on with it in a moment of crisis is something that I was bowled over by, particularly for the big shareholders for whom have a lot of value, personal value riding on it. Their willingness to step back and give me the space and not be treading on my toes or breathing down my neck. It was an act of generosity that I have not seen, and it's perhaps one of the fundamental differences between VC and angel investing and private equity. Because in private equity, it's very much that expectation where everything's being measured and you're on the hook all the time. Whereas in that world of angel VC, it's entrepreneurship. You need a bit of space, you need a bit of time, figure it out, and give them that opportunity. And that was incredible that they did that.
Oh, that's brilliant. Anything you might do differently, sort of looking back on it?
It's such an interesting question. I mean, the answer is everything.
Everything.
A little bit like my golf. There's a learning process. I zigzag up the fairway when I play golf, take far too many shots, and none of them are in a straight line. I sort of think about my journey in the last year as being like that. We're sort of heading in the right direction, but it's definitely not in the fastest route. If I look back on it, I can see those inefficiencies and I could do it differently. That's the benefit of hindsight, I think, in many ways. I guess the other thing I would do more of is investing up front in process and making sure we kind of got those things nailed down. And this is part of a small team. And when you're thinking about how do we set ourselves to scale, you need to overinvest in those sorts of things where people have got used to just acting as a community and actually they need to get a little bit sharper on things. And that's probably the thing I would actively do more of as opposed to just the individual lessons. And that's a continuing need. And I think as any business is scaling, figuring out which are the pressure points you've got to really invest in. We've done lots. So things like we have a totally new sales process and we can now measure stuff. We're starting to do the same in the way we think about manufacturing. We're starting to do the same in the whole customer service. But it always needs improvement. Leaning into those processes earlier rather than being given evidence that you need to is probably a better thing to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess one of the things I take out of that is if part of your challenge is to scale, you've got to figure out the strategic bits, what channels, all that sort of stuff, which sounds like you've done. And then you need to make sure that the actual organization can deliver on that as it grows. That, I assume you don't want to do twice the volume with twice the number of people.
No.
So how are you going to make that happen? Yeah, interesting.
And there are two elements to that. One is, we were talking about AI earlier. Figuring out how you can use AI in a way that allows you to scale with almost the same resource. Intellectually, it's a fascinating question. Lots of people see AI as a threat because it takes away jobs. We're in the luxurious position whereby instead of having to add more jobs and add more cost, this is about AI helping the impact of each individual grow. And that's quite exciting. But the other side of that equation then is you need to make sure you have the right individuals who are able to grow with it. And the constant exercise we have as a team is thinking about how is our job going to be changing and how are we thinking about what we need to do differently. That is inevitably part of the scaling process.
Is there any advice you might give to other CEOs as they think about their own organization's purpose and strategy?
I think having explored and spent time with a purpose in both sort of big corporates and small, and actually with a strategy too, there's always a desire that both the purpose and the strategy, when they're done, they're set. That's our blueprint of what we're going to do. It needs to be a live conversation and a set of live choices that you're constantly evaluating. And if you're not giving yourself permission to change your mind as new information arrives, you're going to take a wrong turn somewhere. Or you're not turning. That's the problem, is I suppose you're not turning at all. And that's often a very difficult thing for leaders to get comfortable with, because it's about embracing ambiguity. But equally, in your purpose, I think the changes are less significant. That's more about degrees in which you're trying to just navigate the choice of words and the meaning of what you're doing so that it is something that really encompasses what the culture of the organization is about and the choices you're trying to make. You are constantly thinking about, have we got it right, and testing it. The play on words about transforming in the world of electricity, kind of like that, and about helping people rather than actually doing the work for them. I mean, all of those things they're kind of important choices. They're set on some fundamental assumptions. And if we can't help people, then actually is that still the right thing for us to say we want to be doing? That's, I think, part of the journey.
Yeah. Anything we haven't touched on that you'd like listeners to know?
Oh, it's interesting. I sit in this world of electricity and energy, and it's one of those things that has been boring for most of our lives. You turn on the switch and you just expect electricity to be there and think no more about it. And we're suddenly in a world now where actually electricity is really important. Particularly as we head into the winter, between 4 and 8 o'clock every day, the grid is going to be under significant pressure, particularly if it's not windy. And there is a huge amount of investment that has to go in to make sure that the lights stay on, literally. If we as a society are not really engaging in how do we all have a role to think about how we use electricity and energy, then we're heading down a really challenging place. And so figuring out how we educate and how we make that part of the conversation is ever more an interesting, challenging problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Anything you'd like to ask me?
You spend a lot of time looking at sort of purpose-led businesses. I think one of those challenges of how often do you revisit it? How do you make sure you're keeping it flexible and alive? And can you see the signs in a business when there's a bit of ossification going on in the way that companies think about their purpose?
You said something in this interview that I think is really relevant to that question. We have to make sure the purpose isn't driving us, that we haven't come up with something and then put it out there, and now that's driving us, that it has to be an ongoing sort of self-expression of where we are and who we are. If any CEO starts asking that question, does this still feel like it's an expression of who we are and what we're about? And if the answer stops being yes, it is, I think it's time to, again, begin that conversation. Who are we? What are we really all about? What's the role we can play? You said something else early on that really resonated for me, which is we could sink beneath the waves and nobody would really even know. And I think one of the best questions about purpose is, if we were gone, what would be missing in the world? And I think if you don't have a really good answer to that, again, time to go back and have a look at it.
Thank you. It's good. That's helpful.
It's been really great. Thank you so much for joining us, and very good luck with Powervault. Perhaps we'll have an opportunity maybe in another year or two to see how it's all gone.
I'd love to do that. Thank you for asking me. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. In addition to being available on our website, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave us a 5-star review. It helps others find the podcast. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.